Thank you for that nice introduction, Jim, and thank you for having me here today. I guess, will tell you a little bit about myself. I was, as Jim says, born in Vancouver, and in terms of my religious upbringing, I wasn't really raised anything. I was sort of, this is a pretty secular corner of the world here in Vancouver Island, British Columbia more broadly. But my mother had a dear friend of hers from elementary and high school and college who was a born-again Christian. And this one who's dear to me became my godmother, and she would send me to a Christian summer camp every year. And after, I don't know, probably about 8 to 10 years of that, I had a born-again experience, or I became a born-again Christian when I was about 16 years old at a summer camp. So this was sort of in the evangelical tradition, but not, I wouldn't say necessarily a kind of Christian right, conservative tradition, if you see a distinction. But so I lived life as a born-again Christian for about 7 years, and that meant going to Bible studies and church every Sunday, and doing your own sort of Bible reading at home every day, and praying, and all that kind of stuff. And when I got to the University of British Columbia, I joined one of the, I guess, 10 or 11. There were almost as many Christian groups at UBC in the late 1980s as there were Marxist groups. And so I joined one of them called InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, which was kind of a sort of C.S. Lewis apologetics-oriented, kind of British intellectual evangelical sort of tradition. And eventually became president of InterVarsity Christian Fellowship when I was in my 4th year. And it was partly through, I think, English training, training in literary studies, training in kind of reading words and thinking about them as stories, how language works, the abilities and limitations of language to, convey truths, including transcendental ones. That sort of gradually, I think, began to weaken my faith that I had. And I think that it was also during this time, one of my Bible studies was the book of Job in the Hebrew Bible, or the Old Testament, which if you haven't had a chance to read the book of Job yet, I highly encourage you to do. One of the famous examples of a kind of theodicy that Jim was talking about, the question that how could, if we have a sort of good and all-powerful God, why is there so much suffering on the planet? That's called theodicy. So it's kind of through partly reading that, and also this is one of the first Bible studies where I really began to think about notions of authorship. Like, who wrote this? And what were they thinking? What was their sort of cultural context? What's the sort of complexity of a literary tradition that maybe stands behind behind the biblical text? And so my doubts began to increase, I'm always responsible, and I finished out my term as president of InterVarsity Christian Fellowship without having a public crisis in faith. But I think probably around that next year, my sort of 7th year as a Christian, things sort of fell apart. And I could no longer believe that the world, I couldn't make sense of the theology anymore in terms of thinking about if there was a good God, why all this, these terrible things were happening. So I kind of lost my way. And like Dante wrote at the beginning of his famous epic poem, The Inferno, except I wasn't midway upon the road of life. I was only sort of really at the beginning. I was only 23 or something like that. But midway upon the road of life, I looked up and found myself in a dark forest, for I'd lost the one true path. So then I became an English professor, and I wrote a couple books. And then I circled back to questions of religion that had, interested me kind of in my late teens and 20s, and so started teaching the Bible as literature, started thinking about religion and literature, and the current threat, I think, that the Christian right poses to democracy in the United States and to the planet. And started thinking about literary representations of that, and wrote a book about that. That's the one that Jim mentioned. And now I teach the Bible as literature to University of Victoria students who, because of many are from Vancouver Island or BC or Canada, don't have that much biblical knowledge, and it's still an important piece of cultural history, and especially literary history as well. So I hope that was suitable as a story, just to sort of give you a bit of background about who I am. Thanks, Jim.